You are listening to the IUS Horizon podcast. Welcome. My name is Josh. Alongside me, I got Courtney, Bengal, Ben, and a very special guest, Dr. Andrew Weaver. Thank you for being with us today. We've just prepared some basic questions. I know, Ben, you got some stuff. So kind of was digging into some stuff, and something that I've been interested in, and I wrote a paper on this my freshman year. It was violence in video games. And more specifically, I was more curious on, like, the development, because I got cousins who are playing, like, your crazy shooter games, all this stuff, when they're, like, I want to say, like, 5 years old. And, you know, we've had some cases where they dug, I believe it was Columbine, where they found that one of the guys, he had an extensive Doom profile, which was a violent video game, and he had layouts of the high school. And this is before the actual tragedy happened. So I'm just kind of curious, because, you know, it's a big debate, rather, if there is evidence here, if there isn't evidence here. In your professional opinion, what have you seen? What have you studied, researched? What's your main stance on it?
So that's a great question. Mm-hmm. And I think that I always hesitate when people talk about something like Columbine or some other mass shooting, right? Because it's impossible as a social scientist to post hoc say this is why this happened. So I think a lot of times in the public that debate gets framed by the wrong kinds of things. Mm-hmm. There is evidence that playing violent video games can increase what's known as disinhibition. So we did some work with researchers at the IU Medical Center in Indianapolis, where we had people do fMRI, get into an fMRI machine after having played either a violent game or non-violent game. Mm-hmm. And what we see in those studies is that the people in the violent video game condition have less activity in the parts of the brain that would normally inhibit our aggressive impulses. Mm-hmm. Right? So in other words, we don't have to learn how to be aggressive as humans. That's a natural impulse. That's something that we're born with. 2-year-olds are the most violent humans, right? Because they haven't that executive center of the brain that would be responsible for saying, you know what, maybe kicking this person in the shins is not the best idea, that there could be consequences to that sort of thing. That builds up over time. Mm-hmm. When we play a violent video game, we naturally have to suppress that part of the brain. Like if our brain is constantly, every time we're about to shoot somebody in a first-person shooter, like, you know what, maybe this isn't the best idea, that's not going to allow us to play the game. It's not going to be fun. And we see that in the fMRI machine, that kind of suppression happens, that there's activity in the more primitive parts of the brain, but the more executive centers are depressed in terms of activation. So there is a disinhibition effect that occurs, but with games, there's a very important caveat, which is that it's because of the way violence is implemented, it's often a task. It's something that you have to do to advance. And so a player who's experiencing a game as a sort of a task reward sort of thing, as a challenge-based process, if they're not processing that shooting act as violence, which is actually a perfectly reasonable sort of response, like the old Space Invaders game, right, where you're like a little blob at the bottom and you're shooting aliens at the top. It's a very violent game, but nobody's playing that game thinking that they're trying to harm those aliens. It's just a task. It's something that you have to do. And if you're processing it that way, and we can do that even with the more advanced, like a Call of Duty or something, right? It could just be, this is just something we have to do to clear the level. We're not processing it as violence. That part of the brain's not activated anyway. Then it's not going to have any effect at all. Mm-hmm. And so it matters how we engage with the content. If we're treating it as a story, if we're thinking about the narrative, if we're playing it as if we're trying to harm other characters, that's going to have a very different kind of effect than if it's just a game with a challenge that we're trying to meet.
And something that I've just seen, because especially with like game ratings nowadays, because mature it's 17 and up, especially with stuff like that, to me is, and I can only speak from my personal experience, I love video games, but like I was 9 years old. You can go into Walmart, GameStop, Best Buy, and with an adult, and adults, you know, kids can lie. Be like, oh yeah, this game, it's just yada, and then, you know, they get something crazy, could have inappropriate content, violent content. So something that I wrote about that I think it kind of faults on that kind of rating and that kind of how we have that restriction, because I don't want to. I'm big thing about me is I don't have kids. I don't want to teach people how to raise kids, but I'm just like, you need to know certain things, especially like video games. I know now GameStop implemented something where they are mandatory for mature games for underage people. They have to tell the parent, hey, this is for strong violence, language, stuff like that. So with all that kind of in mind, and I've even talked to Ben about this a little bit, in terms of responsibility, like you said, it's ever how you interpret it. Would you say it's more on like a parent that kind of needs to be more in tune with it, or do you think it's more on these rating companies and organizations that actually deal the games?
So I think, again, it's a great question. And how much time do we have? Because I could get totally on a soapbox with this, right? Parents, we ask parents to do way too much in terms of media use just in general. I mean, think back to when you were kids, and I'm looking around the table now, right?
Right.
Most of you, I would imagine, had some kind of rules associated with media use.
Yep.
Yes.
And all of you that had rules about media use probably broke those rules.
Absolutely.
Very much so.
So it's especially today when media is mobile, when like their parents just can't possibly control everything that their kids have access to. So that's part A. Part B is that the rating systems that we currently have are completely ineffectual, completely broken, because for a variety of reasons. One is that they are voluntary, right? So the stuff you're talking about, like, not only could you go into those stores and buy them with an adult, you could just go buy them in most stores, right? There's nothing, it's nothing legal about it. Nobody has jurisdiction over it. If a store chooses to limit sales of like M-rated games, that's their voluntary policy. They're not doing that because they have to. And if they don't enforce it, it's no big deal. It doesn't matter. But also, the ratings themselves are, we know this from a lot of content analyses and research on it, they're not consistently applied. They're not accurate. They're not based on anything that we know about how these things actually affect people, right? So there's nothing magical that happens when you turn 17 that suddenly makes a certain kind of content okay when it wasn't okay before. And the kinds of content that's going to get rated extreme, it doesn't correlate very well with the kinds of effects that result, right? So language, for example, the effects of vulgar language are very different, and from a societal point of view, less important than the effects of, say, violence. And even within the types of violence, right? Not all violence is equal in terms of the impact that it has.
Right.
The kind of violence that's most likely to get rated M or R in a movie or TVMA in television is gory and graphic and bloody. That kind of violence actually is more likely to decrease aggressive behavior because it's learning the consequences of violence, learning that violence causes pain and harm that actually makes us less likely to do it. That builds up those inhibitions. What's far more harmful is violence that's sanitized and glamorized and trivialized. It doesn't cause pain. It doesn't cause harm. And that's the kind of stuff you can get away with in a PG movie or in a TV G-rated television show. And so we're putting the wrong things off limits. And we're not giving people, as you said, right, it's important that they have the information about what this contains. So we're not giving people that information. We're giving them an age-based rating that's kind of meaningless and not telling them why it matters. One alternative that's been suggested, and I don't think that I'm going to live to see this actually happen, but that would be, I think, much more effective would be something like the cigarette warning labels, right? Where it's not an age-based rating, it's not anything like that. It's just this product, you look at a cigarette package, this product contains nicotine or whatever, which studies have shown has this impact. The end, right? You could do that with media. This content contains violence that is rewarded and sanitized, and studies have shown that it has this kind of effect. Give people the information, let them kind of figure out what to do with it.
You say that's more of an obligation for media to do it?
I think so. So, again, we're not going to see this legislated.
Right.
Nor, and this is just my personal opinion, nor should we, right? I don't think it's healthy to have the government involved in sort of what media companies can produce. And, there's First Amendment issues that you quickly get into there. And in fact, states have, like California tried to make it a law that you couldn't sell M-rated video games to minors, and the court struck that down on First Amendment grounds. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but I do think the industry has some responsibility to provide information about what the product contains, what kind of impact it might have.
That's stuff that you see with like Japan has bans a number of games based on like whatever government. Like UK, I've noticed is a little bit more strict on that, and like the rating, it's not
especially
M.
in TV as well. But go on.
Exactly, like it will go from like instead of like an M or a teen or everyone, it'll literally be like 18, 16, 7. Like it literally does, and like you can argue either way, like how countries handle it, and something that just kind of like going through it.
Different societal standards as well for each.
Is that what it is?
Yeah. So like in Europe, for instance, I know that violence there is a lot less welcome than USA, but then things related to sex are more common there. Well, it's more taboo in USA.
Really?
So yeah.
Wow. Well, and then like there's always like you kind of mentioned, there's a barometer of violence. Rather you have a game that's really realistic and it's trying to be realistic with violence, and then you got Super Mario Bros, something that's really cartoony and that kind of thing. And especially like with that kind of violence, the cartoon, the mischief and stuff, like to me that's more like a Saturday morning cartoon. So if you're not going to regulate it on like television and movies, why would you do it for a video game? Because to me it's the same thing, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, but actually that kind of violence again is the kind that we're talking about that is going to lower inhibitions, and because it is cartoony, right? Because it is like somebody can get smacked upside the head and like stars will come out of their head for a minute, they'll be a little dizzy and then they'll be fine. There's no consequences, there's no harm. If we were telling parents what to do, it would be, look, if your kids are watching this kind of content, maybe talk to them about how, look, this is not real. Violence has consequences, right? Let's think through that. Let's help them process those kinds of things because that's important. It's actually the stuff where you see the graphicness, where you see consequences, that's better, at least in the context of aggressive behavior and aggressive outcomes.
From what was like studied, do you know what the age demographic is? Because you're talking about obviously younger kids. Do you know what the range is, like the ballpark?
Well, there have been studies. Yeah, there have been studies for all age groups. So this is one of
even into adulthood.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Like the fMRI studies I mentioned were with college students. So yeah, this is something that's been studied all throughout the age spectrum. And the effects aren't limited to kids. Like we tend to think about kids as a very vulnerable population, but
they're more impressionable than vulnerable.
Right, and those processes that are at work in terms of the inhibitions that might get broken down, in terms of, we haven't really talked about this, but hostile attribution bias perceptions, which again are an important part of the aggression process. Like aggression in humans is almost never random. It's almost never like people aren't just going to walk down the hallway and punch somebody else in the face.
It's provoked.
It's provocation. It's a response to that. It's reactive. People who have higher hostile attribution bias, what that essentially means is that they're more likely to see provocations and ambiguous acts, right? So you're at a party, somebody bumps into you, spills your drink. Is that a provocation or not? Maybe it was an accident. Maybe they didn't mean to do it. Maybe it's just too crowded in here and that's why it happened. You could perceive that in different ways. And if you perceive that as just an accident, there's no need for aggression. You're not going to respond with aggression. But if you see that as a provocation, now suddenly aggression is a possibility as an outcome. And so a person with higher hostile attribution bias is more likely to see that as a provocation. And consumption of violent media can increase hostile attribution bias because we're learning essentially that the world's a violent place, that violence is more prevalent than it actually is. So there are lots of ways that this could happen, but again, the context of the violence matters. The type of violence that people are being exposed to matters.
And kind of just one last question and kind of wrap this up because Ben's got another topic he wants to discuss. And it's a little off topic, but he kind of talked about how obviously the world is a violent place. And in just your opinion, especially like there's parents that really do shelter their kids. You know, I've met several parents where the world's a great place, you know, as long as you don't look at the TV too long. They kind of develop this world of like, you'll be okay, just stick to who you know, don't talk to strangers, you'll be fine. So, and this is my personal opinion, I always said there's a fine line. Obviously, you shouldn't show a 5-year-old all the war that's going on in the world in every crevice, but at the same time, you gotta let them know it's scary out there. Like, there are people that you're always at risk for something crazy to happen, so you, like, I remember, like, when you were a kid, what did they tell you? Don't open the door for strangers. Don't get in a car with strangers. We have all these, like, emergency contacts and stuff now. So, with all that, it's like, I'm just, all these parents, just, sometimes I hear this stuff where it's just like, they don't need to know certain things. I'm like, they don't need to know not to open the door for strangers? Like, I get like the probability relatively is low, but it's like it's still like something, right?
But that actually, so I think it's really interesting that you're bringing it up and thinking about it this way, and I sort of agree with you, but I would take a very different angle, and that is that often what we see in terms of fear of crime and those kinds of things that you're talking about, that is a media effect, right? The more media people consume, the more afraid of crime they are, the more likely they believe themselves to be a victim. And these are misperceptions. People who don't consume news, for example, and news is important. Obviously, we need to stay informed, but people who don't consume news have a more accurate perception of the likelihood that they would be a victim of crime, for example, than people who consume a lot of news, because crime leads news stories. Crime is vastly overrepresented in news media. So we get this sort of false perception, I think, that parents do tend to shelter their kids too much, but not, I don't know that the problem is necessarily they're sheltering them from media, is they're sheltering them from life a little bit too much out of fear, right? And there's been a lot of talk about how your generation is one of the loneliest generations now. For the first time since they've been studying this at a national level, your generation reports being lonelier than the elderly report. It's always been the elderly were the most lonely, right? That's changed.
Wow.
Part of the explanation for that is that you don't, your generation's parents sheltered you, didn't let you ride your bike down to the park, hang out with friends, right, and do things like that out of their supervision for fear of you're going to get abducted, you're going to be the victim of some horrific violent crime, even though that's extraordinarily unlikely. In other words, what we're seeing again, I think, is in part at least a media effect, and so they're sheltering too much, but in a way, it might be good if they sheltered them from media a little bit. It might be good if they sheltered themselves from media a little bit. If any of your parents watch, like, true crime documentaries or listen to true crime podcasts or watch, like, the Dateline NBC kinds of shows, then they probably call you up and they're like, oh, my God, this co-ed got murdered and so, don't ever go out at night by yourself, right? And, like, tell them to stop watching those kinds of shows because their perception of that fear is way out of line.
And that's something that I was like dealing with because, like you said, people that are like older in my life, I've had aunts and uncles where if it's on the internet, on the news, that whatever that person says, newscaster, that's fact, 100%. And they'll go into everything. And then like I'll have somebody be like, "Did you hear what happened in Arkansas?" And I'm like, "I'm here. Why would there is an element of why should I care if it doesn't affect me? Why would I consume this if I'm not directly affected?" I'm not saying it's the right way. I'm just saying there is, and I've kind of mostly how I feel, it's like, why would you bother? So, and then before I like really turn over to you, my big thing with like media is, and talking about just how much really you should consume, how much you shouldn't, because everything's got bias at the end of the day. It's like, and people, like, they do their own research, but even then, that can be dangerous in on its own, because if people are set in their ways, they're not going to break from it. If you're convinced that this so-and-so is correct, it's impossible to change the story. So in terms of like communication, and I've been talking with more older people in my life, what are some things that I can bring to light to them to kind of be like, hey, all this stuff, we live in a world, everyone wants to yell fake news at everything. It's like, what's a way that I can be like, hey, how about we take some steps to really fact check this stuff that you're seeing and listening?
That's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to that question. I mean, the scourge of fake news is a huge problem,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not even. I would argue that the bias that we see is not in and of itself a terrible thing. There are other. You mentioned the UK, for example, right? They've always had a media news organizations that everybody recognizes. This one's left-leaning, this one's right-leaning. Like that kind of bias gets built in, and I think that's okay. In fact, I think that's inevitable, right? When you have so many options to choose from in terms of where you get your news, you're naturally going to gravitate to the places that fit with your perspective and talk about things that you're interested in talking about. The problem is, as you say, like the lack of sourcing, the lack of factuality, the elevation of opinion to the level of fact, that's what we have to figure out how to deal with. That's what's causing so many problems in terms of misperceptions that people have, misunderstandings that people have, these situations where we have debates about, again, I think the wrong thing a lot of times. We could have much more productive debates if we centered them in some in more accurate sorts of ways, but we're not, because there's so much false information out there. I have not figured out how to get around. If I had, I would be, on the national talk circuit,
right?
Well, it's just shouting from mountaintops.
Well, you hit it. It's very oversaturated in terms of news stations, articles, social media. Just the whole market's really oversaturated. Now I know, Ben, you said you had some stuff to take to a different topic.
Before we fully move on from that, I was curious about your study you had mentioned earlier, where you said you compared non-violent games to violent games, and what would you define as a violent or non-violent game?
So, violent games would be anything where you as a player are acting with the intent to harm other characters. And so it's the definition of violence that we use is really centered on intent to harm. So it's not about the outcome as much. Like if you shoot at somebody and miss, that would still be considered a violent act. If you accidentally cause harm, that would not be. And so you're trying to cause harm to another player in the context of games. Nonviolent games would be those that you are, of course, not. Like that's not the objective. That's not part of the play. So yeah, that's how we define it.
Okay. So moving on from that a little bit, I believe you're also focused in like race and media, correct? Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, and of course, in regards to racism, that's not really a comedic topic, but sometimes you still see the concept of nationality being brought up in like comedic context. What's your opinion on those two things versus each other? Are they connected? Would you say they're separate?
I would say they're related. And when we talk about race in the context of perception and stereotypes, mm-hmm. It is an immediate impression, right? It's not about like an accurate genealogical history of the person. It's not about their geographic history, right? It is what we see. And so if nationalism is part of our person perception, then it works the same way, right? And so if Middle Eastern becomes the identifier, for example, if Mexican becomes the identifier, then it can have the same sorts of effects on person perception that Black or Latinx or whatever would have.
Okay. Do you think it's important to kind of withhold that information? Because I've seen some things, I'm not trying to take a stance on this, but like there'll be, and this is just reactions I've seen, if there was, say, whatever tragedy happens in the world, and like they're like, oh, we have someone in custody, and they don't reveal name or anything, there's this narrative of people like, Well, that's how you know, like, it's not a white guy. You know what I mean? Like, people are trying to push that, but it's like, is there some kind of truth that where people are like from a news standpoint, it's like, hey, let's not reveal what race this guy is because we don't want people from the get-go just attacking this guy because it's just a dude in custody. This dude's not convicted or anything. So is there some truth to, like, is it really, like, that important? Like, how much should we let the public know about, like, an accuser of something like that?
It is sort of a catch-22 for the news organization because when you use, we call those racial tags, that is, you identify somebody based on race. It's a black suspect. It's a white suspect. One thing that we've seen in the studies is that reporters are much more likely to use a racial tag if it's a minority suspect. So it's a white suspect, it's just the suspect.
Gotcha.
When it's a black suspect, it is a black suspect. I don't think that's intentional. I don't think that's the journalist trying to be racist. It's just if you're a white journalist, the race of the perpetrator, the suspect that's going to be in the crime report is much more noticeable if it's an out-group race member. It becomes an important identifier. If it's white, that is not an important identifier for the in-group person. So that's one problem. The second problem is what you're alluding to, right? If you don't use the racial tag, people will misremember the suspect as black. Not even intentionally, not even, like what you're talking about is like, well, that's just them.
Yeah, people jumping the gun on it.
But in studies where they show people a news story and it's just a suspect, not racially identified in any way, and then they ask them after the fact, like, was this suspect white, black, Latino, not specified, or I can't remember, right? They can say, the correct answer is it wasn't specified. They could say, I don't remember. Overwhelmingly, white participants will say that was a black suspect when it's not there. So it's like if you're the news organization,
you're kind of at a lose-lose.
Like there's not a good solution. That's a sort of a bigger issue in terms of stereotypes associated with crime and things.
I have a question that like jumps back a little bit from a couple topics ago, just really quick because it's sticking with me. So whenever we were talking about violence and how there's different types, there's intent and then non-intent, it kind of brought me back to like how you say some violence is glamorized, like you hit somebody in the head and there's stars that come out, but then also there's the side of games where it's intentional, and if you shoot somebody, there's going to be blood, gore, and all types of different things. So have you had any have you heard any like counter arguments from like not even just parents specifically, but anybody else interested in those topics who say that like it's not that big of a deal to glamorize violence, since glamorizing violence, I would say, kind of seems like violence is okay and it doesn't have a big effect? Does that make sense?
It does. And I think the reason the public tends to get concerned about the wrong things is because violence that shows consequences, violence that shows pain or is graphic or gory is uncomfortable, right? We don't like to watch it. We don't like to see it. We feel some disgust. The number one phobia for Americans is blood, right? So it's something that we're uncomfortable with. But from an effects point of view, it's that discomfort that is kind of the point. Like, we should feel uncomfortable about violence. We should think about the consequences of violence. That's what helps us to inhibit our violent impulses, right? Because we all have violent impulses. We all, in a situation of provocation, the amygdala, the primitive part of the brain, is going to generate violent impulses. We're going to want to just punch that person right in the face. It's the more advanced part of the brain that's like, actually, maybe let's rethink that a little bit. We want that. We want to feel uncomfortable about violence. That's good. And so there's the disconnect, right, is that people are upset about the stuff that makes them uncomfortable, not thinking about the fact that that's probably good that you feel uncomfortable about that. Maybe we should reinforce that idea. The glamorized violence doesn't feel like a big deal, like you're saying, because it's cartoony, it's no consequences. But
I had never even thought about it that way until you brought it up.
That's a lot of people.
Honestly,
a lot of people wouldn't even define that as violence, right? Is like the stuff we see in cartoons. That's not violence. Nobody's hurt, but that's actually problematic from an effects point of view because nobody's hurt.
Yeah, I think that's why it stuck with me so much, because that honestly was like the initial time that I had heard that, and I was like, wait a minute, like I've never even thought of it that way.
Right.
But it's a good point, because like he said, I don't have kids or anything, but at the same time, watching a kid maybe watch like like the Mario Brothers or whatever, and the stars coming out of their head, and they're like, oh, I can go hit my brother in the head, and like he's gonna be fine. But some kids are strong, and like, what if he gives his brother a concussion or something, and they don't realize the damage that they can do from watching things that aren't realistic.
Yeah, and I think again, the brain doesn't work quite in the realm of those sorts of specifics, right? So we also, as a public, tend to think about violence in the context of like imitation. Like somebody's going to see a wrestling move and then go try it on their brother, and it's going to go wrong. But the kinds of processes that we're talking about don't require that level of specificity. Like if we're learning that violence doesn't have consequences, that's generalized in the brain, right? That's just a sort of, that's a disinhibition that occurs. It's not that hitting somebody with a mallet is okay. That is just violence is okay, right? And so we don't, the brain connections aren't at that level of specificity. So there's, and again, we see this in the fMRI studies, there's longer term sort of consequences to this that apply beyond just what that specific violent act was in that context.
What do you feel is more harmful for children? Violence in media or pornography or nudity in media?
Violence for sure. Nudity, I would argue, is to the extent that people are concerned about nudity, that is a value-based judgment, not an effects-based judgment. Okay. I mean, I consider myself a scientist, right? So I can't say anything about somebody's values, whether that's nudity is a problem or not.
Yeah.
But I can speak to the effects of it, and the effects of seeing nudity are essentially nil, right? In terms, and what people tend to be worried about with sexual content is how that's going to affect behavior, right? Is that going to cause people to have sex earlier? Is that going to increase the likelihood of like teen pregnancy or risky sexual behaviors, those kinds of things? Seeing nudity has no effect on that. What has a much, so again, we tend to be focused on the wrong kinds of things. What has a far greater effect on that is just characters talking about sex. If you look at any sitcom that features, young adult characters or characters in their mid to late 20s, right? Every episode, it's about sexual interactions. It's about who they slept with, and the humor is based in this.
Right.
And it's like that's the whole storyline. That is way more impactful than even pornography in terms of people's attitudes about sex.
The show Euphoria is like a really big one for young adults, and that show is supremely overloaded with that type of content.
Although they do talk about consequences a lot in that, right?
Yeah.
Like
They
a
do.
lot of it is like
There's actually even a show called Sex Ed.
yes, which
is-
also talks about, that's a great show. It
Yeah.
also talks about consequences and thinks a little bit more deeply about. Now, there's still, one of the main effects of this kind of sexual content for college students is, again, a misperception of how common sex actually is. So most college students have a very inaccurate perception of what their peers are up to, basically.
Yeah.
So if you think about, for example, how often, say, the average college student or college-age person is hooking up with someone else. 60% of college students have had no sexual activity of any kind with another person in the last month. But that's not the perception that college students tend to have about their peers. The peer is, in the past month, the average college student's hooked up with 2 or 3 different people.
Right.
That's not accurate. Where do we get these misperceptions? We get them from sex ed, from New Girl,
All this
from
stuff.
shows where they're constantly hooking up. A month would be a really long dry spell for most television characters.
Yeah.
So the norms that are associated with sexual activity are way out of line. And another part of the reason for that is that we're not taught that in actual sex ed, not the TV show, but sex ed in schools. We're not taught that by parents. We're not given accurate information about what people do, what is typical, what's normal. And that's a big gap in our knowledge, and so the media fill that gap in.
Any closing questions? Or anything like that?
Say, going back to the concept of like stereotypes, would you say that stereotypes are like, inherently harmful, or are there situations where they would not be? Is it nuanced or a non-nuanced topic?
I think that's a good question. I think no, they're not inherently harmful, because a stereotype is just a collection of ideas, attitudes about, in this case, I assume we're talking about a group of people. They're probably an overgeneralization inherently. That's kind of the point. Our brain categorizes, right? So we need to build these categories for efficient processing. But it's not what that stereotype contains. Could be positive, could be neutral, could be negative. So it's not inherently bad. So then we have to ask the question of, well, what is filling in those stereotypes for us, and what is the information that in this case media, since we're talking about that, contains.
What are your thoughts on race swapping in media? It's become more of a common thing lately.
I think it's fascinating that there's so much more of an uproar when a character people think about as white is cast with a minority, as opposed to the opposite, which is so much more likely to happen.
Right.
Whitewashing of films is there's a long tradition of that, because the studios, and I do research directly related to this, and I've spoken with casting directors, I've worked with people in the big Hollywood studios to try to think about some of these issues a little bit more. They believe that casting minority actors in big budget films is going to hurt, or could hurt, the bottom line. That it could reduce the likelihood that the white audience is going to go see that film. And so they're much more likely to take characters that are minority characters again in real life or based on source material, whatever, and turn them white, because they're worried that if they didn't, then whites would be less likely to go see it. And whites are the largest audience just based on numbers, so that would have the biggest impact on the bottom line. And obviously that's a big issue, right? Imagine going to applying to be a surgeon at a hospital, and they're like, you know what, you're the most qualified person for this position. You have the best resume, but you're just not quite the right color.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get the job.
Well, sometimes it works out. Like there's shows like the Spider-Man, animated Spider-Man, where the main Spider-Man character is actually African American. That did seem to work out pretty well.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That's a great example, and that's what my research suggests, is that there, in movies at least, there is a race effect in that the more minorities you cast, the less interested whites are in seeing the film. But the reason for that is really a marketing issue that Hollywood has kind of told us over the last 20 years, that there are black movies, there are Asian movies, and that these movies are for their particular audience.
Yeah.
If you can and the reason then that whites are less interested in seeing those films is because they believe they're not part of the intended audience for the film. It's not that they feel like they can't connect with the characters or connect with the story. It's that this wasn't made for me.
Mm-hmm.
If you can overcome that with marketing, you overcome the cast race effect. And there are lots of examples. Black Panther, they made that. They didn't treat that as a movie for a black audience only. Nobody went to that like as a white potential audience member, like, I don't know if this movie is actually made for me or not. Of course it was. It's a Marvel movie, huge budget, big marketing push, and it worked. It worked. The box office was identical for that as it was for the Avengers. So it is an effect, but it's an effect that can be overcome. There's good examples like Miles Morales that show that.
There's
Now it's
a-
just a matter of convincing the industry.
There's a sitcom called, or not a sitcom, like a rom-com, where it's called Crazy Rich Asians.
Yep.
And that's like it was the number one like box office seller for romantic comedies until the recent like Sydney Sweeney movie.
Yeah.
But it was like number one.
And that was a movie, right, that Hollywood did not think would do that well.
Yeah.
So Black Panther is one model. It's one exception that sort of proves the rule. The other was a movie like Crazy Rich Asians, which had a really small production budget relative to other movies like that. And it, interestingly, did better its second weekend than it did its opening weekend, and then better again its third weekend than it did its second weekend, which is a pattern you almost never see with big budget motion pictures. They always do most of their box office the first weekend, and then it goes down. Crazy Rich Asians went up. And the argument for that, from my perspective, is that it was word of mouth was spreading. Like the white audience was originally looking at that largely like, well, this isn't a movie made for me. It's a caste race effect happening. But then their friends start talking about it. People start posting about it on social media. Word spreads. Box office goes up.
Yeah.
Any last questions? I pretty much got everything I want to add. All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
It's really good we have a guest on because I feel like one thing that kind of I've always wanted to push, at least with the radio, is having more like professionals and people who are kind of had that experience giving their insight. I think it's important, especially like when you talk about like a student body, because you provide that research for us. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. It's been fun.
All right. Thank you so much for listening to the Horizon Podcast. As usual, we're live with this every Wednesday around 4:15. And then, of course, you can watch the full versions on Spotify and the YouTube channel at IUS Horizon Media on YouTube. For that, thank you guys so much for listening. One last thank you to Dr. Andrew Weaver. This has been the Horizon Podcast.